The sun shone brightly over Buckingham Palace, making the Golden Gate sparkle. The streets were busy with tourists, some taking pictures, others watching the famous royal guards standing tall in their red uniforms and black hats. Among them was Sergeant Daniel Carter, a dedicated soldier who had served in the British Army before earning the honor of guarding the palace. Daniel stood firm, his face expressionless, as people passed by, some whispering in awe, others giggling as they tried to make the guards move. He was used to this. The royal guards were trained to stay still, no matter what happened around them. Their job was not just to stand. They were highly trained soldiers, ready to protect the royal family if needed. The day seemed like any other until a man in his late 40s walked up to Daniel. He had a rough look, wearing an old jacket and jeans. His hands were in his pockets, and he had a smirk on his face, as if he was looking for trouble. He glanced around, noticing how people admired the guards. But instead of respecting the tradition, he decided to test Daniel's patience. At first, he tried to joke around, making silly faces and waving his hands in front of Daniel's face. Daniel did not react. He had seen this type of behavior many times before. Tourists often try to make the guards smile or move, but the guards never responded. That was part of their discipline. The man chuckled, then stepped even closer, standing there all stiff. Think you're better than us," he muttered under his breath. When Daniel still did not move, the man frowned, feeling frustrated that his efforts were being ignored. A small crowd started to form, curious about what was happening. Some people took out their phones to record, thinking it was just another tourist trying to make a guard react. But something about the man's expression was different. He wasn't just being playful. He was looking for a reaction, trying to stir trouble. Then, the man took a step back and whistled. That's when a large dog appeared from behind him. It was a strong, muscular pit bull with a thick leather collar. The dog looked alert, its ears standing up as it focused on its owner. The man gave the dog a quick glance, then turned back to Daniel with a grin. The crowd murmured, sensing that something was not right. Some people stepped back, unsure of what the man planned to do. Daniel, however, remained still, his training keeping him calm. He had faced real danger before. This was just another test of his discipline. But what happened next would shock everyone watching. The air around Buckingham Palace felt different now. The cheerful chatter of tourists had quieted, replaced by a tense silence. All eyes were on the man and his dog. Some people whispered to each other, unsure of what was about to happen. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Sergeant Daniel Carter remained still, his posture perfect, his expression unchanged. Years of training had taught him to never react, no matter what. The royal guards were more than just ceremonial figures. They were soldiers, prepared for any situation. But even he could sense that this moment was different from the usual harmless pranks by tourists. The man, still smirking, gave a quick glance around, as if enjoying the attention. He then looked back at Daniel, his eyes filled with mischief. He wanted a reaction, and when he didn't get one, he stepped even closer. "What's the matter, soldier?" he said, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Too scared to move. The crowd stirred. Some looked worried, others simply curious. Daniel remained focused. He knew that ignoring troublemakers was the best way to handle them. If he showed any reaction, it would only encourage the man to push further. The man let out a small laugh, shaking his head. He bent down and patted his dog's head. The pit bull looked up at him, its tail wagging slightly, waiting for a command. The bond between the man and his dog was clear. The animal was loyal and well-trained. The man stood up straight again and crossed his arms. "You guards think you're so tough, don't you?" he continued, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Dressed up in those fancy uniforms, acting all high and mighty. But what happens when something real comes your way?" A few people in the crowd exchanged nervous glances. It was clear now that the man wasn't just joking around. He wanted to cause trouble. Some tourists slowly moved away, sensing that the situation could escalate. Others stayed, too curious to leave. Then, without warning, the man tugged at the dog's leash slightly. The pit bull tensed up, its ears perking forward. It wasn't being aggressive, but it was alert, waiting for its owner's next move. The man grinned again. "Let's see how good you really are," he muttered under his breath. He gave a sharp whistle, a sound that immediately caught the dog's attention. The pit bull took a step forward, its muscles tightening. The crowd gasped, realizing that the man was about to do something reckless. But still, Sergeant Daniel Carter did not move. His eyes remained forward, his posture unchanged. He had faced far worse situations in his military career, and he knew one thing for certain: staying calm was the key to handling unpredictable moments. However, the man wasn't done yet. He gave another command, this time louder, and the dog responded instantly. Gasps filled the air as the pit bull suddenly lunged forward. The moment the dog lunged forward, the crowd reacted with a mixture of gasps and shouts. Some people stepped back, others froze in shock. The pit bull, strong and muscular, moved swiftly, its eyes locked onto Sergeant Daniel Carter. The leash slipped from the man's hand, and for a split second, time seemed to slow down. But even in that tense moment, Daniel remained motionless. His years of training had taught him one important lesson: never let fear take control. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing even. He had faced dangerous situations before, and this was just another test of his discipline and skill. The dog's paws hit the ground hard as it raced toward him. Its body was tense, its ears forward, its instincts sharp. But Daniel, with his trained soldier's eye, noticed something important. The dog wasn't attacking out of aggression. It was following a command, acting out of loyalty to its owner. This wasn't the dog's fault. The crowd held their breath. Some people even closed their eyes, not wanting to see what would happen next. And then, just as the dog was about to reach him, Daniel moved. It happened so fast that most people didn't even see it clearly. With precise and controlled motion, he shifted his foot slightly, changing his stance just enough to take control of the situation. As the dog leaped up, Daniel raised one hand in a firm yet calm gesture. His body language spoke volumes, not of fear, but of authority. To everyone's astonishment, the dog hesitated. Right in front of Daniel, it stopped midair, its body twisting as it tried to understand what was happening. Instead of tackling him, the dog landed just inches away, confused but no longer aggressive. It let out a short bark, its tail twitching as it looked back at its owner, waiting for further instructions. The crowd murmured in disbelief. People whispered to each other, trying to understand how the guard had stopped the dog without touching it. Some even lowered their phones, too shocked to continue recording. The man, however, was not pleased. His grin had vanished, replaced by a look of frustration. He had expected the guard to panic, to react in a way that would give him something to laugh about. But instead, Sergeant Daniel Carter had turned the situation completely around. Daniel's face remained calm, his eyes steady. He didn't look at the man. He didn't break his composure. But there was something in his stance, in the way he had handled the moment, that sent a clear message. He was in control. The dog, still confused, let out a soft whimper. It had been taught to obey commands, but it had also recognized something powerful in the guard's presence. Without another word, it lowered its head slightly and sat down right in front of Daniel. The crowd erupted into applause. The sound of applause filled the air as the crowd processed what had just happened. People who had been holding their breath now sighed in relief. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others excitedly whispered to one another. They had just witnessed something incredible. Sergeant Daniel Carter had stopped a charging dog without even touching it. The man, who had released the dog, stood frozen, his confidence shaken. He had expected chaos, maybe even fear, but instead, he was left standing there, embarrassed in front of everyone. His own dog, which he had used to intimidate the guard, was now sitting obediently at Daniel's feet, looking up at him as if waiting for a command. Daniel didn't move, his face as calm as ever. His years of training had prepared him for moments like this. He had served in intense situations before, where quick thinking and control over emotions made the difference between success and failure. This was no different. The dog let out a small whine, wagging its tail slightly. It no longer saw Daniel as a threat. In fact, it almost seemed to respect him. The way Daniel had stood his ground, the authority in his body language, everything about him signaled leadership. The man's face turned red. He clenched his fists, clearly frustrated that his plan had failed. He had wanted to embarrass the guard, to make him look weak. But now, the entire crowd was against him. People were shaking their heads, some even whispering words of disapproval. A few were still recording, capturing his humiliation on camera. "Get up," the man finally muttered, tugging at the dog's collar. But to his surprise, the dog didn't budge. It stayed right where it was, sitting next to Daniel. It was as if the dog had made its choice. The crowd laughed softly, amused by the unexpected turn of events. The man gritted his teeth, tugging harder. "Come on," he hissed. Finally, the dog stood up, but instead of running back to its owner, it hesitated. It turned its head toward Daniel, almost as if seeking permission. Daniel gave the dog a slow, steady nod, a simple gesture, yet powerful enough to reassure the animal. Only then did the dog walk back to its owner. The man's jaw tightened. He yanked the leash and turned around quickly, trying to disappear into the crowd. But it was too late. Everyone had seen what had happened. A few people clapped again, this time not just for Daniel, but for the lesson that had been taught. Respect and discipline always win over aggression. As the man stormed away, Sergeant Daniel Carter remained at his post, unmoving. He had done nothing more than what he was trained to do: stay calm, stay strong, and never be shaken by intimidation. The people around him, however, saw him differently now. He was no longer just a royal guard. He was a symbol of strength, control, and dignity. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement. What they had just witnessed was nothing short of incredible. Sergeant Daniel Carter had not only remained calm under pressure, but he had also gained control of the situation without a single act of aggression. The Royal Guard, known for their discipline and composure, had once again proven why they were among the best trained soldiers in the world. Meanwhile, the man who had tried to cause trouble was now walking away, his frustration evident in his stiff movements. His plan had completely backfired. Instead of making the guard look weak, he had made himself look foolish. The video of the entire incident was already spreading online, with people eager to share the remarkable display of discipline they had just seen. But one thing still surprised everyone: the dog. Even after its owner had pulled it away, the pit bull kept glancing back at Daniel. It was as if the animal had sensed something different about him. Unlike its owner, who had used intimidation and force, Daniel had shown control and authority in a way that the dog respected. One of the onlookers, a young boy, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, did you see that?" The guard didn't even move, and the dog listened to him, he said with wide eyes. His mother smiled and nodded. "That's real strength," she whispered. Daniel, still standing at his post, remained professional, his face unreadable. But inside, he was fully aware of everything that had just happened. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. If he had reacted the wrong way, if he had panicked or shown fear, the outcome might have been different. But his training had prepared him for this moment. He knew that true power didn't come from physical force. It came from control, discipline, and confidence. A few feet away, the man tried to pull his dog along. But something strange happened. The pit bull hesitated again. It looked back at Daniel one last time, its tail wagging slightly. The animal had recognized a leader, and it wasn't the person holding its leash. The man muttered under his breath and walked away quickly, disappearing into the crowd. The tension in the air slowly faded, and the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace returned to normal. People went back to taking pictures, admiring the beautiful architecture, and enjoying their day. But for those who had witnessed the event, the moment would not be forgotten. One of the security officers who had been watching from a distance finally approached Daniel. He gave him a small nod of respect, speaking just low enough so only Daniel could hear. "Well handled, Sergeant. That could have gone very differently." Daniel, still looking straight ahead, responded in a calm, steady voice. "Just another day on duty, sir." The officer chuckled and walked away, but Daniel knew this wasn't just an ordinary day. He had made an impact, not just on the crowd, but on the very meaning of what it meant to be a true soldier. The video of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, it was shared across social media platforms, gaining thousands of views. People from all over the world watched in amazement as Sergeant Daniel Carter stood firm while the man's dog charged toward him, only to stop at the last moment, completely under his control. The clip showed Daniel's remarkable composure, his steady posture, and the way he calmed the dog without even touching it. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, security officers had been keeping a close eye on the situation. Although the man had walked away, his actions had not gone unnoticed. The authorities had reviewed the security footage and gathered witness statements. Several people had recorded the entire event on their phones, and many were willing to testify about what had happened. It didn't take long for law enforcement to track the man down. Officers found him in a nearby area, still muttering to himself angrily. He was clearly frustrated that his plan had failed, but now he had bigger problems to face. Two officers approached him calmly. "Sir, we need to have a word with you," one of them said in a firm but professional tone. The man scoffed. "For what? I didn't do anything." The officer remained patient. "We have video evidence and multiple witness statements about your actions near Buckingham Palace today. You endangered the public and caused a disturbance. We need you to come with us." Realizing that there was no way out, the man sighed and reluctantly allowed the officers to escort him away. The crowd that had witnessed the incident earlier heard about the arrest and nodded in approval. Justice was being served. Back at the palace, Sergeant Daniel Carter remained at his post, as disciplined as ever. Even though the situation had passed, he did not let it distract him from his duty. A royal guard's job was to protect, to stand with unwavering focus, and to never let emotions interfere with their responsibilities. However, Daniel's actions did not go unnoticed. His fellow guards were impressed by how he had handled the situation. Even the palace security team admired his ability to stay calm under pressure. They knew that many people in his place might have reacted differently, perhaps with panic or aggression. But Daniel had shown true strength through discipline and control. As the sun began to set over Buckingham Palace, tourists continued to admire the historic landmark, taking pictures and enjoying their visit. But for those who had been there earlier, the day had been more than just another sightseeing experience. They had witnessed something extraordinary, an example of leadership, respect, and quiet power. Somewhere in the city, the man who had caused the disturbance sat in a police station, thinking about what had happened. Perhaps he had expected to feel victorious. But instead, he was left with a lesson he would never forget. And at his post, Sergeant Daniel Carter stood tall, ready for whatever came next. As the evening settled over Buckingham Palace, the air was filled with the sound of tourists chatting, cameras clicking, and the occasional flutter of a flag in the breeze. The earlier commotion had passed, but the story of what had happened that afternoon was still fresh in people's minds. Many visitors were still discussing the incident, amazed by how Sergeant Daniel Carter had handled the situation. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, the man who had tried to cause trouble sat on a wooden bench outside the police station. He had been questioned by officers about his actions and warned about the seriousness of what he had done. Though he hadn't been officially charged, he knew that his behavior had not gone unnoticed. His attempt to humiliate the royal guard had backfired in the most unexpected way. He leaned back against the wall, letting out a long sigh. He had always seen authority figures as people to challenge, people to provoke. But for the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who had won a battle without even fighting. Daniel's quiet strength had left a deep impression on him, one that he couldn't shake. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft whine. Looking down, he saw his dog sitting beside him, staring up at him with large, curious eyes. The same dog that had hesitated in front of Daniel, the same dog that had seemed to recognize something in the royal guard that even he hadn't. The man ran a hand through his hair, feeling a mix of frustration and reflection. "You liked him, didn't you?" he muttered. The dog wagged its tail slightly as if agreeing. At that moment, something clicked inside the man's mind. For years, he had used intimidation to get what he wanted, believing that force and aggression made a person strong. But today, he had witnessed something different. True strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or trying to scare others. It was about control, discipline, and respect. Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Daniel Carter remained at his post, unaware of the thoughts running through the man's mind. To him, the incident was just another moment in his duty, a test of patience and self-control, nothing more. He had done what he was trained to do: protect, stay calm, and never let emotions dictate his actions. However, what he didn't realize was that his actions had reached beyond just that one moment. His discipline had left an impact, not only on the people who had watched, but also on the man who had tried to challenge him. As night fell, the man gave his dog a final pat on the head and stood up. He had a lot to think about. For the first time in a long time, he felt the urge to change, not because someone had forced him to, but because he had seen something in Daniel that he wanted to understand. And as he walked away, his dog trotting beside him, he knew that this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. A few days had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, but the memory of it still lingered in the minds of many. Videos of Sergeant Daniel Carter's remarkable composure had spread online, gathering millions of views. People from different parts of the world praised his discipline and control. Comments flooded in, calling him an example of true strength. Daniel, however, remained unaware of the attention he had received. He continued his duty with the same dedication as always, standing at his post, focused and unwavering. To him, every day was the same, a commitment to discipline, honor, and respect. But while Daniel moved forward with his usual routine, the man who had caused trouble was experiencing something new. Ever since that day, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had gone there with the intention of creating chaos, but instead, he had been the one who had walked away feeling change. For the first time in his life, he began to reflect on his actions. Why had he always tried to provoke others? What had he been trying to prove? And more importantly, why had Daniel's reaction affected him so much? His dog, the same pit bull that had hesitated in front of the royal guard, seemed to sense the change in him. The man noticed that his loyal companion had started responding to him differently, more calmly, more obediently. It was as if the dog had picked up on something he himself had not fully understood yet. One evening, as he sat in a small park with his dog by his side, he made a decision. He didn't want to be the kind of person who used intimidation to get attention. He wanted to be better. But he knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to learn. A thought crossed his mind. What if he learned more about discipline, about control? What if he could train himself the way Daniel had trained himself? He had always assumed that strength came from power, but now he realized that true strength came from patience and self-control. The next morning, he did something unexpected. He signed up for a training course on self-discipline and leadership. He wanted to understand the mindset of people like Daniel, people who remained strong without resorting to force. It was a small step, but it was a start. As weeks went by, the man slowly changed. He became more patient, more thoughtful. He stopped trying to provoke others and instead focused on improving himself. His dog, who had once been trained for aggression, now responded to his gentler approach with even more loyalty. One day, while scrolling through his phone, he came across the video of Daniel again. He watched as the royal guard stood firm, unshaken, his presence commanding respect without a single word. A small smile formed on the man's face. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. And it all started with a lesson he had never expected to learn, from a man who had shown him what true strength really meant.